Ladies and gentlemen, we're joined via Zoom by Mr. Mensah. He's the president of Rugby Africa. Mr. Mensah, welcome to VOA Africa. How are you doing?
Very well, thank you.
Let's delve into it. The Springboks recently made history, winning the Webb Ellis Cup 4 times. Let's start off there. Tell us your reaction to that final against New Zealand.
Oh, it was momentous. I mean, I was in the stadium, over 80,000 of us, and expectations were high. But what I said before and I said afterwards is that when destiny is with you, nothing can change it.
Now, to delve into it, of course, South Africa has been a country that's been topping world rugby statistics since 1995 when they won the Webb Ellis Cup for the first time. Fast forward to 2023, they made history by winning it the 4th time. But to look at it from a continental standpoint, would you argue that South Africa's performance at the World Cup is a reflection of the state of rugby in Africa?
I think it's a state of reflection of sport generally within Africa. I mean, the issue of the Springboks being the greatest in the world, that is accepted. They've repeated the championship, which is very difficult to do. And yet it is that some parts of the continent are not as well developed. And that is really because of money. I think we see the same, whether it's at NBA and all the other sports. That you've got one little light, and yet it is the athletes across the continent are quite extraordinary. And I think underfunding generally, lack of participation by governments in terms of funding, and then obviously trying to get our global body to come more to the table is the reason that you see this disparity.
Now, Mr. Mensah, I myself, a former rugby player, I grew up on the continent. I've lived in different countries. I heavily spent a lot of my upbringing in South Africa, playing rugby in South Africa. And one thing I can say is South Africa invests in rugby from a grassroots standpoint through to professional standpoint. What needs to be done, looking at that model that the Springboks and South Africa has created across the whole continent to ensure that every African country can stand up to South Africa?
Well, I think it's not about standing up to South Africa. It's standing shoulder to shoulder with South Africa to take on the world. Mm-hmm. And I think you've answered the question part yourself, and that is the problem. Sports these days is a professional issue. It's no longer the old Olympic charter of just participating. And therefore, there needs to be investment. And the investment does, as you rightly say, start at grassroots level and then moves right the way through. I was recently with the Minister of Sport in Morocco, an incredible man who's invested millions in the grassroots program. We're seeing it now in Uganda. We're seeing it in Kenya. If governments do not come to the table and we're just waiting for our global body to turn everything around, that's where the problem starts. And South Africa, the school systems, the college systems, right the way through, there is backing, right the way through to ensure that the talent, which clearly and undeniably is there in Africa, comes through to the fore and shines.
Now, I want to follow up on that point right there. Some of the nations you just mentioned are really, really excelling when we talk about sevens rugby. But somehow when it comes to 15s World Cup rugby, they don't participate or they don't feature. What is the reasoning behind that?
Again, you come back to funding. Look, if it is that we, for example, as president of Rugby Africa, I have a budget of less than $2.5 million, 2.3 million for 39 countries on the second biggest continent on earth. I'm hampered in terms of where we can go. So, I mean, I took this rollover about 8 months ago plus. And the key really is letting people understand that, first of all, that sport is big business. And secondly, that you need a fundamental mindset shift internally from within Africa, within Rugby Africa, within unions within Africa, within governments themselves, often who contribute zero across the continent of Africa, and then back up to the governing body as well to say, look, this is the way it is. We actually need not so much the training at the moment, because that is ongoing continuously, but we need money for competition space. If it is the major unions, major countries in Europe, for example, and those in Australia, New Zealand, etc., will play 8, 10, 12, 15 test matches a year. In Africa, there's some people who play a test match every 2-3 years. So you're never going to be in that kind of a state of readiness to even appreciate the modernity that requires nutrition and everything else, medication, rest, recuperation, that it takes to make a modern sports person. So a complete mindset shift is required at all levels if we're actually going to be able to close that gap.
Now, to talk about your operations as Rugby Africa, you partially touched on how you're investing in sports. But what exactly do you guys have planned to ensure that the sport grows across the whole continent?
Well, that's a fundamental issue that we are, and it comes back to the whole understanding that sport is big business. So from where I sit, I know I can push my global body so far, but it's really turning around to low-hanging fruit. And some countries are ready to play that game. A lot of them are not. And that is getting governments involved. I noticed in Oceania, governments put a minimum of 40% of the requirements in. In Africa, there are some countries where governments put absolutely nothing, zero into play. So it's really turning it around and making sure that we look at different kinds of funding, that we can then look at different models that will give competition space. The problem is not the athlete. We've seen that. You take a Tendai, the beast from Zimbabwe, and put him in South Africa, he becomes one of the greatest props of all time. And you're finding that. In France, there are 1,200 Africans who are playing rugby in France today. And you see the national team has so many, Ficou from La Côte d'Ivoire and so on and so forth. In the UK, we have 4 or 5 or 6 of African descent. So clearly, the talent is there. It's not a question of whether are they, as a continent, good enough, athletic enough, brave enough. It's really about how do you now get all parties to understand that sports can be the conduit of growth, the conduit of peace. The values of rugby are so unique. The issues of respect, solidarity, working together, all the things that other sports don't quite have. And yet it is, you've got people who are 2 meters tall and others who are 1 meter 60, those who are 75 kilos and those who are 160 kilos. Mm-hmm. It has a place in society for everybody to develop. And trying to get government first and foremost, because they must put in infrastructure. They must invest and make sure it's part of the national curriculum at school level, as you have in South Africa and you have in New Zealand and in all of these places. Then our incredible youth can actually get up and not saying, oh, I'm 6'4", 115 kilos, I'm too big for football, what can I do? Guess what? You could be an extraordinary open side flanker and be able to play rugby.
Mm-hmm. Now, as we wrap up, Mr. Mensah, I want to talk about the upcoming World Cup, which is 2027 in Australia. Last week, we heard World Rugby announce that the World Cup in 2027 is going to be historic. They're going to be expanding it to 24 different nations. What can be done to ensure that Africa can have more representation beyond the Springboks? We can have a Kenya, we can have a Zimbabwe, we can have a Botswana, Morocco.
We can do. I think that the pathways to qualification are currently being examined. I welcomed it, although a lot of people didn't welcome this move to 24 teams. I welcome it because I believe that we're in preparation stage. It's not like a free-for-all. Hey, now you've got 24 or 30 teams, let's go play. Rugby has become, all sports actually, have become so professional. And even I, as a former rugby player, when I watched some of the matches, like France playing against the Springboks, the physicality in that game was extreme. Mm-hmm. If we're not ready, if we're not prepared, the worst thing that we can have is major injury. Africa has a different problem. And I think if we get our funding sorted and our competition space sorted, I imagine that come the World Cup after, one in America, I would expect to see more teams than what you currently have coming from Africa. I think it's a good base. But we got to get our act together. And I think we are. I mean, look at what happened recently in the sevens, as you rightly said, where Kenya Springboks in Zimbabwe last month for Olympic qualification in the men. And naturally, just marginally lost out to the women in Tunisia. You see Ugandan sevens improve dramatically. And the 15s, there has been no 15s rugby played in Africa this year. So whereas others have played 10, 15 tests, there simply isn't the funding to fly somebody from Dakar to Madagascar. That could be a $1,500 ticket, as opposed to flying from England to France for an $80 ticket. Right. So the fundamental logistics currently just do not favor us. So we're trying to look and see, how do we adapt to our reality? I'm not one for sitting there and crying about what is not being done for us. I will fight for what should be done for us. But it's about what do we do to make it right? How do we create that space that our kids, our youngsters, who quite clearly have a different level of athleticism, should be able to be part of something that will then show itself at the world stage at the World Cup in the future.
Well, Mr. Herbert Mensah, the president of Rugby Africa, thank you so much, sir, for taking time out to be with us.
Thank you very much indeed.